ESG 2.0 is real and it is here. There have been some key drivers around this ESG renaissance. Okay, so there are a lot of people now talking about ESG who are talking about it as though, hey, I was walking down the street and I saw this thing called ESG. And I'm like, dude, that's been around for like 2 decades, more. But for a lot of people, they're thinking it's quite new. And so where has that come from? Why do we have this emergence of renewed interest or indeed new interest in ESG? I think there's been some key drivers. And the first is that we have had both a reminder and a kind of concentration of attention on our global interconnectedness. And certainly, I think the pandemic really brought that into hard concentration, just how deeply interconnected we all are, that we are going to have to deal with all types of issues as a global collective. It also demonstrated as well how deeply interconnected and indeed inextricably interconnected our financial systems are today. And so there is this emergence, these contemporary crises, I think, are really pushing attention on ESG issues right now. I don't want this to be a depressing session, but we've got the climate crisis, we've got geopolitical conflicts, we've got still emerging issues from the pandemic. And when you read some of the reports coming out of the WHO about the potential for another pandemic, which I don't want to talk about, we do have some major global issues that we need to deal with. And ESG is now being seen as a key part of that. Thank you. So what's different in ESG 2.0? What does it look like? What do I see as someone who's been studying this for a very long time now? What do I see as the difference? What we're seeing now is a lot more concentration of governance-based or government-based initiatives and emerging regulatory requirements for ESG concerns. So in Australia, late last year, we launched something called the Net Zero Authority. And that is a new government agency that is tasked with, as the name suggests, getting us to net zero by 2050. We're seeing as well investor frameworks. So not only does the World Bank have its IFC, social and environmental performance standards, many of the other multilateral development banks, which are making major investments regionally, they have these types of performance standards that they're applying. And we also have things like the Equator Principles, which relate to broader lenders and the types of ESG activities and actions that are expected of them when they fund big projects. Finally, we're also seeing an emergence of new and enriched transnational standards. So for instance, across the European Union through the European Commission, in July 2023, they introduced the European Sustainability Reporting Standards. And so this is now a requirement. In Australia, if you are an Australian Stock Exchange listed company, you have requirements from the Australian government now to report formally on your ESG issues. And we are expecting later this year that there will be requirements for climate-related reporting, including how much carbon activity those businesses are creating or decarbonizing. So all of these things are starting to come to the forefront. Thanks. Okay. Whew. See, at this point, I'm like, either people are asleep or we don't know what's going on, so I just put some dolphins. Yeah. Okay, so how are we doing? What is ESG and why does it matter? It matters because we are more interconnected than ever. We are facing a series of intense, from climate to geopolitical conflict, and we know as a collective, and certainly governments around the world agree, that we need to do more than address our economic and financial issues. So ESG 2.0, we're starting to see more government level regulation. And in Indonesia, you can see that through the blue-green digital policy agenda, and the types of regulation that emerge are yet to be seen. And also how this is being defined. But it is real. It is more than greenwashing, but it does also require much greater critical engagement, because to date, ESG is used largely as a kind of buzzword. And I think we can do better. Thank you. Okay, so the question then is, Why? Why should we worry about ESG? I've already started to make this argument a little bit. We'll go to the next one. The World Bank has been doing some really terrific work. For those of you who have your phones, and slides will be available later, I've put some QR codes in that will take you directly to some resources, and I'll move so I'm not standing in front of the code. What's really interesting is they're now starting to talk about something we call social sustainability as distinct to environmental sustainability. And this has 4 components. We're looking at social inclusion, so the ability of diverse groups of society to participate equally in socioeconomic opportunities. We're looking at social cohesion. So how well do communities interconnect and come together? We're looking at regulatory legitimacy. So are governments doing the things that need to be done to support communities? And all of this needs to occur through something called procedural fairness. And procedural fairness means that community members feel that whether they agree with the final decision or not, they feel that they have had a transparent, open, accessible opportunity to participate in the decision-making process. So in Australia, we look a lot at something called community engagement. Some of you might call it public participation. I work a lot in the area of social impact assessment. And all of these things are really, really critical to ensuring that our local communities and community members have an opportunity to participate actively in the decisions that affect them. So that's what social sustainability is looking at, and it's a really important part of this S in ESG. Thank you. So why is ESG important for Indonesia then? We'll go to the next slides. Really, it's not for me to tell you why it's important for Indonesia, because I'm very obviously not Indonesian. In fact, I'm not even really Australian originally. So as you can tell from my accent. If I were to say, though, why we want to be concerned, not only in Indonesia, but internationally about ESG right now, in our research that we're doing at I2S, we have identified 6 emerging themes for the S in ESG. And the first, as many of you will know, Indigenous and First Nations people's rights in Australia are very much top of the policy agenda and incredibly important. And you have Indigenous groups here in Indonesia where that also becomes quite an important issue. So Indigenous and First Nations people's concerns. Socioeconomic inclusion, that capacity for all members of our societies to have equal opportunities for participation, whether it's socially or economically. Social value. In Indonesia, in the renewable sector alone, we're looking at US $20 billion of investment in the fair and just transformation, and that's just one component. In Australia right now, the government is implementing the largest ever infrastructure pipeline in Australian history. It is worth more than 300 billion Australian dollars. It's huge. So we need to see how we can create broader social value beyond just those big investments in road upgrades and renewables infrastructure and water infrastructure, sanitation and hygiene. We want to see what is the social value that can be created beyond that. Well-being and the connection to health is emerging as a key theme in the S, as is resilience. So as we have more and more severe financial crises, one of the biggest challenges right now for students coming from Indonesia to Australia is cost of living. And that is because we have enormous inflationary pressure. Yeah. So these issues, the capacity of our communities to be able to accept shocks, accept crises, accept changes, adapt to them and bounce back, that's what resilience is about. And finally, then we have this notion of a fair and just transition. So very similarly to social inclusion, to social value creation, to concerns with Indigenous people, this is the broad idea that the way in which we transform our energy and climate systems must be done in a way that is sensitive to fair and equitable transformation. One of the first things that I teach my students in a public policy course that I teach in our Master of Public Policy at the Crawford School is that whenever we take policy decisions, there are winners and losers. And as we transform our energy systems, there will be winners and losers because we are going to have to accept trade-offs. The key to a fair and just transition, though, is that we have an awareness of that and we attempt to reduce the negative trade-offs. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to make a quick argument as to why we should focus on the S. I think I've already given some very broad examples, but I want to give you some data and some evidence to support my claims. And I'm going to do that from three perspectives. I'm going to talk about a business case. So who's here is in like economics and finance? Nobody? Okay, that's cool. All right, well, I'll give you a business case. So if you're talking to your economics and finance friends, you can say, oh, you don't care about ESG? Well, here's a business case for that. Oh, we got, yeah, Bernie, come on. It's okay, he's just having a snack box. All right, and then we've got the policy case and the communities case. Okay, so we've got three perspectives here that we'll share, and I'll give you some evidence. Thank you. So one of the things that we're looking at in our large program of research is something called social risk management. So how do governments and organizations manage their non-technical risks, the risks we don't usually look at? And what we see is that the majority of organizations that we've surveyed in Australia, this is a longitudinal survey that we run. It's called the State of Infrastructure and Engagement. We're now in our 7th year of this longitudinal survey. Just over a quarter of organizations would say, look, the first way that we manage our social risks is by worrying about externalities, by worrying about our business reputation. And we'll go click it again. And what you'll see as well is that the business case means that people are very focused. So when they're looking at the S, they're focused on the financial costs of getting the social piece wrong. How is this going to affect our reputation as a business? How is this going to affect our capacity to earn more money? Or as a government, how is this going to affect our ability to get reelected? We often talk about a social license to operate, the level of acceptance of a policy or a project within a particular community. And the business case is very much focused on reputation. So if we have a good reputation now, for those of you who listen to Taylor Swift, reputation is really important, right? It's a saleable thing. And how does that reputation then influence what we can do in the future? If you are Taylor, you can have a big concert tour and become a billionaire because you have a good reputation. Okay, next. In Australia, in our 7-year study, we ask infrastructure sector professionals, so the people who are delivering this $300 billion pipeline, every year we say, where you were delivering projects in the previous year, what were the most influential factors to project delays or cancellations? Because delays cost money and cancellations cost a lot of money, sometimes billions of dollars. In Australia alone, we have costed over 30 billion Australian dollars in project losses contributed to by community opposition and stakeholder pressure. So the S from the business case really matters. What you can see here is that stakeholder and community pressure is ranked by professionals as amongst the top 3 most impactful factors for major project delays every single year of our survey. So the S does matter from a business case perspective. Next slide, please. Almost 40% of our respondents will tell us where they experienced major project delays or cancellations. Stakeholder pressure played a role to a good deal to a great deal. And we'll click again. And we'll click one more time, please. Sorry, when I have the clicker, I don't have to do so much verbal clicking. Yep, we'll go forward. There we go. So from a business case perspective, there is a very clear evidence base to demonstrate that getting the social piece wrong costs money. And for major projects, it costs money in terms of delays and cancellations. And it can cost into the billions of dollars. Perspective number two, then, what is the policy case? Nobody raised their hand when I said, are you doing business and finance? Anybody specifically looking at policy in here? Okay, maybe I'm at the School of Music and I didn't know, but we'll see. All right, so the policy case. Why are we worried about the policy case? We surveyed almost 7,000 members of the Australian public. And we said, you know what, the Australian government that you pay a lot of taxes to, we pay a lot of tax in Australia. The Australian government that you pay taxes to, what is it that really makes you accept the infrastructure investments the Australian government is making? And what is it that makes you trust that the government is acting on your best interest? The number one driver of Australians' trust in infrastructure project investment and delivery, you can see it here, it's regulation. So the confidence that citizens have in the effectiveness of regulation to guide infrastructure investment and delivery is the number one driver of trust, and it also drives acceptance of projects. So from a policy case, getting the policy guidelines and the regulatory settings right, really focusing on that S, how are these projects affecting local communities? That's absolutely critical. And we'll go to the next slide, please. More evidence for the policy case. When we break this data down and we look at the Commonwealth, the overall, we look at Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, and South Australia. These are our 4 big states along the east coast of Australia. You can see that even when we disaggregate the data, trust in government is the same across the board. And it's followed importantly by transparency. The work that's been going on in Indonesia now for around about 15 years on anti-corruption and integrity, transparency, at least in the Australian case, is absolutely critical to public trust and acceptance in major project investments. So I think, again, these are comparative lessons that we can think about, and I'd be really interested to hear from you in the question time. How does this affect Indonesia? And do you think maybe these responses would be the same here? I think some of them might be. Yes, please. Okay, we'll skip through this one, but basically what we're concerned about in terms of S is that trust in regulation, the legitimacy of the government and the government organizations that are putting that regulation in place. So do they have a mandate? And also credibility. Are these organizations ones that have been proven as capable of delivering? Thank you. And finally, the communities case. So this is a really complicated graphic. That's okay. You don't have to go into the detail, but I put this up here to show you that even on the social side of things, remember before I said what gets measured gets managed? As a social impact assessor, I often hear, oh, but the social stuff is intangible. Like we can't really assess that. I want to say 2 things. The first is that is true. There are certain things in society that we as human beings value simply because we do. It might be a beautiful work of art or a piece of music or a Taylor Swift song. I can tell I have some Swifties over here. But it might also be your cultural heritage. It might also be the character of your hometown or your home village. So there are certain things that not only can we not quantitatively measure them and assess them, I would also say we shouldn't. We should simply agree that they have value. At the same time, and this is the second part, which is a little bit contradictory, it's really important that we do assess the social components that we agree we are able to. Social components are not impossible to measure. They're not all intangible. And where we do assessments on the S in ESG, it can really help to strengthen both policy and practical attention to social components. Otherwise, you've got technical engineers, you've got risk managers, you've got investors making decisions. And they are making the decisions largely on hard quantitative data. And the social components are left out because they are not articulated and presented in a similar manner. Oh, it's fuzzy. Oh, it's soft. Oh, it's too difficult. So there is a very strong argument to be made as to why we need to assess and present social data in a technical way, much like what's here. So this is a partial least squared structural equation model of factors that influence levels of resilience in Australian communities relative to major infrastructure projects. This is really, really important when we think about strengthening the S and ESG, because we can go into a meeting with engineers and finance managers who have their own models and graphs, and we can say, but wait a minute, guys, do you know what? There is a statistically significant relationship between what risks this community perceives from this project and the levels of resilience in that community. So this is very powerful data, and it's quite important. So one of the things we need to do in the S is work to develop and present social data. We'll go to the next slide. Sorry, guys, there's no clock in the room, so I'm just walking over here to check the time. Okay. So the other thing that we can see from this, from the community's perspective, why should we focus on the S? Because the relationship quality between the project proponent, which in many instances, and certainly in Indonesia, is the government. So it may be a private developer who's delivering and constructing the project, but the government has made the large investment. Relationship quality is the #1 driver of resilience relative to major projects. When we talk to professionals in the sector and we ask them, to what extent do you agree or disagree? Infrastructure development, these billion-dollar investments that we're making, they should contribute to social inclusion. 52% of industry professionals in Australia say, yep, we agree. This should contribute to social inclusion. And if we click it one more time, you'll see a further 24% strongly agree. So what this tells us is that the majority of professionals within the Australian infrastructure sector think that they should be contributing to the S in ESG, that their work shouldn't just be delivering good technical engineering projects, it should be increasing social value. Next, please. So there's lots of ways that major infrastructure investment can contribute to social value creation. And in Indonesia, I'll be interested to hear from you. What do you think these big investments should be doing? Should they be providing more access for people so that they can get infrastructure and services? Should it be about housing affordability or maybe choice of type of housing? Maybe it's about well-being and safety and security. These are the types of issues. These are the top 5 issues that come out from Australian respondents. We'll go to the next one, please. Okay, so a bit of a summary. Why does the S matter? We've got a business case, which I hope I've made fairly well in a relatively short amount of time. So we can focus on cost and keeping costs down by focusing on the S. We can focus on acceptance of projects, which also helps to keep costs down and to deliver them more efficiently with fewer resources. And we can focus on reputation, that future business. So there is a very strong business case to be made for strengthening and focusing on the S. There's a policy case, good regulation, good policy guidance, trust to drive project acceptance and legitimacy and credibility. And finally, the community's case, we can see through data, through evidence, that a focus on the S can help to support levels of resilience in local communities. It can improve and enhance social inclusion and get more groups an opportunity to participate equally in communities and societies. And also that we can get more social value from these big investments. So we'll go to the next slide, and this is going to be, okay. Would you all agree now that I have made a case that is really important in ESG. And also there's this dog there to like wake you up again. So we've had dolphins and a random dog with a crown. I know it means nothing relative to the presentation. It's just a funny photo. Okay. So would you agree that we now have a pretty good argument for why we should focus on the S? Yep. Okay. It's really hard to say no, isn't it? Right? Like there's some some international person standing on the stage. You're not going to disagree with me. That's okay. That's the power of the microphone. All right. So I'm going to go with that we've done okay, and we've said why the S and ESG is critical. And we'll go to the next and final question then. And that's how. Okay, so that's all really great. You know, we've clearly defined what ESG is today in terms of ESG 2.0. We've talked about why it does really matter and why we should incorporate and strengthen the S within the ESG. So how do we do that? Yes, next. Okay, for yourselves, I would be thinking here in this part of the discussion, I'd be really keen to hear from you in a moment. How does ESG connect to blue, green, and digital? So how can this connect directly to current policy agendas? Yes, please. There are some big challenges to integrating the S and to really strengthening it. And one is that there's very blurry boundaries. So when we talk about the legislation and management of major infrastructure projects, including renewables projects, they are governed on a project by project basis. And you see this in Indonesia, particularly in the mining and resources sector, where it has been very difficult historically to get a mining company to own up and take responsibility for its social impacts, in large part because they'll say, well, but we didn't cause that. That was a pre-existing issue. So there's some very blurry boundaries around causality. The other thing that we're seeing is that throughout the world, Indonesia is no exception. We have very intensive project environments and development environments right now. And that means that your local communities are experiencing what we call cumulative effects. So it's not as though there's one big project or development happening. There's several all at once. And that can make it really difficult for governments or private sector project proponents to parcel out what are their effects. So we're really starting to talk now about the importance of doing cumulative impact assessment. And it's also an under-resourced area. So the E, we've got a lot of scientists, we've got a lot of engineers, they're well paid, they're out there in the field. The G, similarly, we've got really great public administrators and people who are focused on governance in the corporate world and finance as well. These are technical, well-identified roles which are professionalized. But for the S, and I'm going to use Australia as an example, we estimate in our research institute that about 84% of the social practice professionals, the community engagement professionals, the communications professionals who are working on these big technical projects, do you think they're men or women? Oh, Reza, thank you for saying men. So about 84% are women. Yeah, so community engagement, because, and I'm really glad that you said that, and I'll be interested to talk to you later about why. Yeah, we can have a chat with another snack box over lunch. About 84% of these professionals in Australia are women. So working on the social, the soft side of major projects. And what we see is this is a really highly feminized profession. And indeed, some of the other professions like the engineers and the finance managers, they would argue it's not even a profession, but it is. Social practice is a technical profession. And for those of you pursuing social science degrees, okay, so who's doing politics or social science in here? I don't know what you guys are studying. We'll do a poll later. Okay. All right. But this is a very under-resourced area, and it's a highly feminized workforce. And that has all kinds of implications for the power of the S in ESG. So what can we do to better integrate it? What we need are more systematic, more accessible, and more comparable tools. So right now in our institute, we're working on social risk management tools. which would allow for social risks to be identified, assessed, and then managed in ways which are very similar to and integrated with more technical risks. We'll go to the next one. The other thing that's really terrific, and for many of you, I would encourage, if you're thinking about careers that are going to involve major projects or the environment, impact assessment is a great start. And we do have the International Association for Impact Assessment. Up until July 2020, I served as global president. We are the world's largest membership body for impact assessment professionals, with more than 7,000 members in 120 different countries. So impact assessment is a really great start as well. And I've mentioned that we just had our conference in Dublin. Now, it's not a bad thing to do. Okay, we'll go to the next one. Social impact assessment in particular can assist, and I'm going to skip through the slides here fairly quickly so that we can have time for a chat. Yep. For those of you looking at the investments being made by multilateral development banks, many of these banks now are developing something called ESFs, environmental and social frameworks. The World Bank just revitalized their own last October. The Asian Development Bank currently has their ESF draft consultation out. And so if you do wish to have a look at that, that's available online. And the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development similarly has an environmental and social risk management framework. You can see from the fact that the ADBs is currently in consultation, that the World Bank was just released last year and the EBRD was in 2019. This is a relatively new regulatory space, and I think it's one that's going to grow. I was just at the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank's Board of Governors meeting late last year in September in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, with their chief economist, and they were starting to look at how they could have their own ESF as well. We'll go to the next one. We've got a number of principles and performance standards too, and I'll share these slides. So for anybody who is interested, all of these are available online, but the OECD Blue Dot Initiative is one that I think is quite interesting because it's the world's first certification for sustainable infrastructure projects. Next. Within our own institute, we have developed something called the Infrastructure Engagement Excellence Standards, and we are seeing a number of governments pick these up as a way to quantify, monitor, and assess that relational performance between big projects and communities. And we'll go to the next one, and then I think we're almost done. I talked about social risk management, so we'll skip over that one. Okay. So this bird is a tawny frogmouth. Every year in Australia, we have a favorite bird competition, and any Australian can vote what's your favorite bird. Very recently, the tawny frogmouth won. I highly recommend it as a bird friend. They're really smart and they're kind of cute. Okay, so there's the bird photo. But look, we know that there are ways in which the S in ESG is commonly addressed. We've talked through all of that. I know, it's funny, right? Yeah. Yes. Apparently this bird looks like Reza. So you guys can talk to him about that later. You are the most popular bird in all of Australia as of 2023, Reza. So that's a good thing. So we know that the S in ESG is commonly assessed through a variety of frameworks, but also that we have some work to do to develop the measurement and assessment tools so that they are more systematic, robust, and consistent relative to their technical counterparts. We definitely have some specific opportunities, particularly through social impact assessment, and that includes gender and human rights impact assessment to improve the ways that we monitor and address the S in ESG. And I think too, as Indonesia continues to look to the blue-green digital agenda, and the renewables rollout occurs. And you also have some really interesting questions about the historical economic importance of the mining industry here, and also the move to critical minerals mining to support renewables technologies. There's going to be some big opportunities that emerge, and the S is going to be really, really important, particularly when we think about the potential land access or acquisition that may need to occur for that mining, and how that relates to communities being resettled. So lots of interesting things happening there. I may have one more slide, which is like a final slide. I don't know. I can't remember at this stage. But I will leave it at that so we can have a chat with Alfie. Thank you all so much for your time and attention. And please ask questions because that's the most interesting.